1923, Germans burned banknotes to keep warm. In 1939, that same country rolled tanks across the Polish plain backed by a modern industrial war machine. What changed in between, and what single political choice by the democracies of Europe helped stretch that catastrophe into a multi-year global war? The answer pivots on economics as much as on ideology, a deliberate Allied decision to delay direct military confrontation, to pursue appeasement and buy time, gave Nazi Germany the breathing space it needed to hide, mature, and magnify a covert war economy. That delay did not cause the war. It helped make the war far bigger and far longer than it might otherwise have been. In what follows, we'll trace how a fragile, improvised financing system, theft on an industrial scale, and the Allies' cautious politics combined to turn a ticking financial problem into a world-shattering conflict. First, the context. Germany's collapse after the First World War was not only political, it was fiscal and social. Hyperinflation in 1923 erased savings, upended ordinary life, and left generations suspicious of financial and political elites. The Great Depression that began in 1929 hit Germany hard. Industry slumped, unemployment soared into the millions, and the liberal institutions that might have managed the crisis appeared unable to restore stability. Desperation is not an explanation for ideology, but it is fertile ground for political movements that promise rescue. By the early 1930s, millions of Germans had little to lose. Into that vacuum stepped leaders who combined nationalist rhetoric with promises of economic revival. Hjalmar Schacht's name deserves attention here because he provided that revival, at least on paper. A respected economist and former central banker, Schacht first won credibility by stabilizing the currency and arresting hyperinflation's worst effects. That legitimacy granted him latitude to design unconventional financial mechanisms when the regime demanded rapid rearmament. The most consequential of these devices was a set of hidden promissory instruments known to historians as MIFO bills. MIFO, short for Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, was less a real company than a fiscal facade designed to let rearmament spending take place outside the ordinary budget. How did MIFO work in practice? Imagine a government that wants to order arms from private firms, but does not want the spending to appear on its official ledger. Rather than pay factories in cash, the government instructs an ostensibly private company to issue IOUs, promissory notes payable at some future date. The manufacturers accept those notes as payment and use them like money, but when they need immediate cash, they take the notes to a bank and get them discounted, sold for a slightly reduced amount, to obtain liquidity. The bank then holds the note and, if necessary, brings it to the central bank to be rediscounted. Essentially, the central bank advances cash to the bank against that IOU. The critical feature is that, in the public accounting, these obligations are not recorded as normal government debt. They circulate as quasi-private liabilities until they must be honored. Put simply, it was an off-the-books chain of IOUs that hid rearmament from both domestic scrutiny and international treaties. This construct created a dangerous timeline. Between the mid-1930s and 1938, these MIFO obligations swelled. Historians frequently cite a total on the order of billions of Reichsmarks. A commonly referenced figure is roughly 12 billion Reichsmarks, though exact numbers should be checked against archival studies. For a state intending rapid militarization, that volume amounted to a second balance sheet built in shadow. The bills carried maturity dates. They were not perpetual. They were a loan with a due date. By the late 1930s, many of these instruments were scheduled to come due around 1939. That created what some in the German government and central bank began to call a deadline, a date at which the hidden liabilities would have to be converted into visible obligations or paid from real economic resources. MIFO alone did not sustain the arms effort. The Nazi political economy rested on several pillars that together made territorial expansion not merely a policy choice but, increasingly, a structural imperative. First, the creative accounting of MIFO masked the scale of rearmament and deferred the fiscal reckoning. Second, plunder and occupation exactions furnished resources from day one of conquest. Seized factories, commandeered raw materials, forced requisitions, and occupation taxes all contributed immediate material gains. Third, forced and slave labor became a central input. Millions of coerced workers drawn from occupied territories augmented production and depressed labor costs across German industry. Fourth, systematic theft and expropriation, most brutally of Jewish property but also of political opponents and occupied populations, redirected wealth into state and corporate coffers. These were not incidental crimes, they were integral to the system. Each pillar fed the others. MFO created the illusion and pretext for limitless rearmament. Conquest delivered the raw resources and industrial capacity to meet demands when bills matured. Slave labor cut costs and boosted output. Expropriation and the plunder of financial assets bolstered the regime's cash position in ways that official accounting could not. In short, expansion was both the strategy and the financing plan. Schacht, who had engineered much of the fiscal sleight of hand, repeatedly warned by the late 1930s that the financial structure was unsustainable. He cautioned that the off-ledger obligations and the pace of arms spending risked a tremendous collapse when those obligations fell due. Hitler and others, however, saw conquest as the solvent: seize foreign assets, extract resources, and let military gains plug fiscal holes. That analytical frame is vital to understanding why the Allied decision to delay confrontation mattered. Between the mid-1930s and the outbreak of full-scale war, Western democracies faced a brutal political arithmetic. Britain and France emerged from the Great War with ruined economies and societies deeply averse to another mass conflict. Armies had been neglected, rearmament was incomplete, and public opinion across both countries, and in much of the British Empire, was scornful of leaders who might risk another slaughter. At the same time, the United States embraced isolationism, making any collective muscular response transatlantically precarious. Faced with that reality, the political leadership in London and Paris repeatedly chose delay and diplomatic containment over immediate military action. The Munich Agreement of 1938 provides the most famous symbol of that choice: a negotiated ceding of Czechoslovak territory to Germany in the name of peace. But Munich was not an isolated moment. It was an expression of a broader policy: tolerate limited German gains, use negotiation where possible, placate domestic fears, and buy time to rearm. That was the single decision the title centers on. This calculated, repeated choice to avoid immediate confrontation and to allow Germany more time to consolidate and conceal its war economy. Why did the Allies make that decision? The answer is not cowardice in the simple sense. It was a complex mix of prudence, political constraint, and grim calculation. Militarily, Britain and France were not ready to fight a total war in the mid-1930s. Their defensive planning and training reflected the last war's lessons, and equipment modernization lagged. Strategic thinkers in both capitals worried that an immediate war could result in catastrophic defeats on the continent, potentially enabling Germany to subjugate the whole of Western Europe before reinforcements could arrive. Politically, memories of the trenches, millions of dead, and the social costs of prolonged conflict made populations loath to accept leaders who promised immediate confrontation. Economically, the memory of financial collapse and lingering depression underscored the enormous costs of another total war. Leaders, therefore, chose a path that appeared to minimize immediate risk, accepting short-term compromises for the hope of longer-term security. That choice had consequences that were not only strategic but structural. By choosing delay, the Allies granted Germany time to expand its concealed obligations into real capacity. The window of diplomatic negotiation and political restraint allowed MFO funds to be spent, production lines to be retooled, and enterprises to scale up with little interference. As Germany absorbed Austria and Czechoslovakia, it did more than gain territory. It gained factories, engineers, and resources that could be redirected into war production. Each diplomatic concession removed obstacles to German industrial growth and further deferred the fiscal shock Schacht had feared. When the bills came due, the regime had used conquest and plunder to underwrite them. Consider a counterfactual without certainty, but with reasoned logic. Had Britain and France chosen to confront German aggression earlier, say, immediately upon the remilitarization of the Rhineland, or at the first moves into Austria, several possible outcomes arise. One possibility: a short, sharp conflict could have disrupted the MFO chain, exposed the hidden liabilities earlier, and forced a fiscal reckoning before the regime had expanded its resource base. An early war might have prevented Germany from mobilizing the same scale of economic and territorial resources that sustained later campaigns. Another possibility, premature military action, given Allied unpreparedness, could have produced rapid German victories, political collapse in Britain or France, or an outcome even worse for European democracies. Both scenarios are plausible. Neither is certain. The point is that delay amplified the plausible outcome in which Germany was able to convert hidden financial commitments into real military capacity. We must also be clear about moral difference. Choosing to delay confrontation, however politically understandable, cannot be equated with the crimes of the Nazi regime. The decision to appease was a strategic and political calculation by democratically elected governments operating under constraints. The Nazis' use of forced labor, mass murder, and systematic theft were criminal practices of unprecedented brutality and must be condemned in the strongest terms. The Allies' delay did not absolve or justify those crimes. It created conditions in which such crimes could be exploited to fuel war-making. Forced labor was not an unfortunate side effect. It was a deliberate policy that contributed directly to industrial output. The theft of property, most egregiously the seizure of Jewish assets, was not mere bookkeeping. It was a theft accompanied by persecution and murder. Any discussion of economic drivers must treat those human costs with solemn gravity. The causal chain can be sketched like this. Off-the-books finance created a deferred fiscal obligation. The regime pursued conquest to cover that obligation. Occupation and plunder provided the resources to honor the hidden bills. Allied delay provided time for these processes to unfold. Each link amplifies the next. An appeasement policy that allowed Germany to absorb Czechoslovakia, with its heavy industry and armaments factories, directly accelerated the transformation of MIFO obligations into tangible military production. The increased industrial base enabled subsequent blitzkrieg campaigns to be larger in scale and longer lasting, drawing in more resources and more victims across Europe and beyond. This analysis raises an uncomfortable moral and strategic question. Was delaying confrontation the better of two terrible options? From the perspective of leaders in London and Paris, the calculus often favored postponement. Mobilization and rearmament take years. Rushing into war without adequate preparation risked immediate national collapse or coerced peace under far worse terms. Democratic leaders had to answer to electorates, judged by recent history and limited by economic capacity. In that sense, appeasement was a rational, if tragic, policy based on the information and constraints of the moment. But rationality in policy-making does not erase responsibility for outcomes. Hindsight reveals that delaying confrontation enabled the Nazi economy's hidden architecture to become overtly destructive. There are further nuances to consider. German rearmament was not merely a product of fiscal disguise and plunder. Ideological zeal, Hitler's personal ambitions, military innovation, and the complicity of industrial elites also matter. Some business leaders willingly collaborated because they profited from state contracts and from the exploitation of occupied populations. Others supported the regime out of ideological sympathy or fear. MEFO itself was possible because institutions, private banks, manufacturing firms, and central bank officials participated in or tolerated the arrangement. In other words, structural economic imperatives interacted with human choices at multiple levels. This is where Schacht's warnings become dramatic. As late as 1937 and into 1938, he voiced concern that the pace of hidden financing could not be sustained indefinitely. He understood the arithmetic. Off-balance instruments must be paid, and payments require either real resources or new borrowing. If the regime failed to secure the necessary resources through peaceful means, conquest offered a brutal but immediate solution. Schacht's dismissal from influence signals the regime's willingness to subordinate prudent fiscal advice to political and military aims. When the state silenced internal dissent, it chose a path that closed off non-violent fiscal remedies and increased the odds of violent expansion. The Allied decision to delay did more than let Germany grow its military capacity. It also eroded opportunities for coordinated resistance. Diplomatic appeasement signaled to other states and to business actors that the status quo could tolerate limited aggression. That tolerance encouraged some opportunistic collusion and constrained the political will for decisive, costly intervention. Even where military planners in Britain and France recognized the growing danger, political legitimacy for action remained thin. The resulting paralysis had real effects. Training programs stretched longer, procurement plans were postponed, and when mobilization finally accelerated, it was against an enemy that had already increased its material advantage. How long did this prolongation amount to? It is impossible to state a single number with analytic certainty. What we can reasonably assert is that the delay from mid-1930s diplomacy through the Munich Agreement and into early 1939 allowed Germany to complete several years of hidden rearmament and to capture significant industrial and resource bases through Anschluss and the occupation of the Sudeten region. Those gains materially changed the balance of forces by the time the full war began. The decision to postpone confrontation did not create the Nazi economic apparatus, but it did extend the period during which that apparatus could grow virtually unchallenged. That extension translated into years of additional conflict once hostilities expanded. None of this implies moral equivalence between the Allies and Nazi Germany. The genocidal policies, slave labor, and plunder were crimes that demand condemnation and cannot be rationalized by strategic choice. But when we ask historical what-if questions about the scale and duration of the war, we must include politics and economics alongside military action and ideology. Appeasement was not simply naivete, it was also a policy grounded in real constraints. The tragedy lies in how those constraints interacted with a regime willing to weaponize economic crime into a strategy for survival. If we step back, there is a sobering lesson about how economic structures shape political outcomes. Off-balance financial instruments can be instruments of deception. Plunder can substitute for taxation. Forced labor can be harnessed to industrial output. When a state combines these levers with aggressive foreign policy, containment becomes not only a diplomatic challenge, but an economic one. Strategies that postpone confrontation may buy time, but they also provide space for an adversary to convert deferred liabilities into actual capacity through theft, coercion, and force. So where does this leave us? The central claim is this: the single Allied decision to delay direct military confrontation, embodied in appeasement and the diplomatic concessions of the late 1930s, prolonged World War II by enabling Nazi Germany to conceal and then convert its hidden financial commitments into a larger war machine. That decision was shaped by legitimate constraints: military unpreparedness, public reluctance to repeat the slaughter of 1914-18, economic exhaustion, and the absence of a reliable transatlantic security partner. Those factors made immediate confrontation a risky gamble that could have led to swift catastrophe. The moral judgment is therefore complex, a tragic but perhaps defensible policy choice that nonetheless helped magnify the subsequent human catastrophe wrought by the Nazi regime. History rarely offers neat moral verdicts. Instead, it gives us tangled cause and effect chains where culpability and constraint coexist. Recognizing that the Allies' decision to delay made the war longer does not excuse the crimes of the Nazis. It clarifies how political choices, economic mechanisms, and human brutality combine to produce larger-scale tragedies. It also reminds us to scrutinize the hidden accounting and coercive economics that can underwrite violence in any era. Imagine for a moment that you were an Allied leader in 1938. Your armed forces are underprepared, your citizenry refuses another war, and the only plausible extra-national support seems years away. How would you weigh the risk of immediate confrontation against the risk of allowing your adversary time to grow? There is no easy answer, only the hard lesson that choices made under constraint can still have consequences that outlive those constraints by years and by millions of lives. What do you think? Was postponement the lesser evil given the alternatives, or did it represent a strategic failure that made the eventual fighting far worse? Share your thoughts below, and if you value evidence-first history that wrestles with hard moral and strategic questions, subscribe for more deep dives.